Hello and welcome to World History Encyclopedia. My name is Kelly, and today I am joined by two guests, the historian Noah Charney and leading specialist in Balkan studies, Svetlana Slapšak. Noah and Svetlana have teamed up and produced the first collection of Slavic myths for an international readership. And today, I will be chatting to both of them all about their new book, The Slavic Myths, published by Thames and Hudson. Thank you both so much for joining me. I'm really looking forward to talking to you about your new book, The Slavic Myths.
Thanks so much for having us. This is great.
It's probably best to start off with what your book is all about.
Our book is to slightly simplify the entering of the huge and vast and unexplored area of Slavic myths, and the other aim to make it so fuzzy and complicated and interesting that everybody who touches the book wants to go further in exploring the Slavic myths. So that's the aim. It's of course it's in a light category concerning the academic side, but it's in a very heavy duty category concerning the narrative part. So the stories, the 8 stories, are there really to capture the reader, to make him want to read further. And then the academic part is there to give him more clues into more stories, into more reading, into more plunging into the Slavic mythology, which, as we know, is chaotic, non-organized, and often misused by for nationalist goals.
So, one of the things to maybe underscore is that the book has 8 myths that we retell in a contemporary way to open each chapter, and then the chapter is followed up by an analysis of the myth historically, socially, sometimes politically. And so we talk about things like vampires and werewolves, which are originally Slavic creatures. Perhaps the most famous Slavic mythological figure, Baba Yaga, features in another chapter, a witch who eats people occasionally and lives in a hut that stands on chicken legs and can walk around. And then we talk about the Slavic pantheon as well, which is very confusing. Let it be said, it would be great if there was a direct equation between, like, this is the Slavic version of Zeus or Odin, but it's much more complicated than that, with various names for deities, different characteristics and things that they're gods of. And part of the issue is we're dealing with a huge diaspora of Slavs who originally came from the Carpathian Mountains and then dispersed throughout Central and Eastern Europe, going north into Russia, south into Yugoslavia, Yugo meaning south, so southern Slavic lands, and then picking up various local traditions that morphed their belief systems, different variations on terms, and then you get the added twist that we have basically no ancient materials about the myths themselves, and what we have are usually handed down through oral tradition until often the 19th century, when the idea of nations wishing to be independent from the empires in which they functioned for so long started to look for origin stories and began to write their own versions of ancient myths, but that are then adjusted to become these foundation tales for new nations. And they're also Christianized because we're in the Christian era. So it's complicated, but hopefully fascinating. That's the idea.
It is. So many interesting things you just brought up then as well. I think one of the biggest things that I found interesting and I really wanted to ask was sort of your process in, obviously these myths have a long history and we don't know a lot of it. How did you work with knowing that they were oral and then they were written down, but then they were written down with these specific goals in mind, and then writing your own version of that? How did that process go?
Well, in fact, what Noah was doing, narrating anew these stories, was very much in according to the theory that was started by Jean-Pierre Vernant, the French professor and classicist, who defined myth as a free discipline, completely different from religion, the discipline of narrating with very good mnemotechnique, the art of memorizing, the treasury of stories already loaded in the narrator's brains, if you want, and then telling them as a kind of pleasure, performative pleasure, which is then transferred to everybody who's listening to it. So, and everybody is free then to repeat the story with its own, with his, hers own treasuries. And the technique is beforehand very well described by Milman Perry and Albert Lord in their study of Singer of Tales, which is based on the oral tradition of the Balkans. They namely found a guy, a Muslim in Bosnia, who was able to produce tens of thousands of verses. If you give him the motive, the central motive of the story or the topic, and a lot of brandy. So that's a technique that was developed, observed, and described already, and it really doesn't have anything to do with nationalism. It doesn't matter. Lord and Perry did not know about Balkan female singers, which were the bulk of the singers in the Balkans, and then the situation is the same in Anatolia and on Cyprus and so on and so on. So women, Bulgaria, so women are in fact epic singers of tales. So this situation was in fact, if you want, duplicating the theory of Jean-Pierre Vernant about the liberty of narration and the liberty from believing, because you don't believe myths, you just tell them, and the techniques which were discovered on the Balkans.
So this manifested in practice with us reading whatever versions of the myths seemed appropriate and of interest, and then essentially coming up with our own hybrid new version that took elements that we liked, but sometimes borrowed from more than one myth. And it's keeping with the tradition that we write about. So I feel like it's a legit way to approach things, especially because we have this chapters that follow each of the retellings that are deep dive analyses that are researched from a scholarly perspective, but written for everyday readers. And that's a balance I like to strike. This is really a trade nonfiction book, but you can read the stories for fun, and it can be just a pleasurable pastime. And then if you like, you can dip into the chapters and learn more about the figures within them.
That's brilliant. So you've pretty much just added a new layer onto the history of,
that's
of
the
these
idea.
Stories, which is great. And so you mentioned that, you know, they were written in the 19th century with the sort of Christian motives on top. Did you at all try to look past that to the you know, original, or, you know, the versions that 9th century Slavic people would recognize, or did you just take that in stride and just accept that as part of the myths now?
Well, of course, we did this kind of research because there are so many monuments and written stories which were coming from the earlier times, and much of this was preserved by local philologists and pioneers in language and history, like Vuk Karadžić from Serbia, who gathered this material on the terrain and then discussed it and was taught by top European intellectuals like the Slovenian Kopitar, who was his mentor in Vienna, who helped him in everything, who helped him making a dictionary of the Serbian layman language, who was really the good spirit behind the whole project of promoting oral poetry. So we should never forget the teachers and mentors and their role in this. On the other hand, we were always comparing myths with the earlier stages and the mixture that was going on the Balkans. We don't know much about the ancient times, but we know about some Illyrian gods and some Dardanian deities, which appeared in several ancient texts, even in Herodotus. So it's early enough if we want. Werewolf story comes from let's say 5th century BC, if we count for sources, and then Petronius and other who were writing about the same motive or other motives which can be related to later times. And let's mention one phenomenon which is common for antiquity and the Balkans, and it's a real textual proof of the, if you want, the transition from antiquity to medieval times and later, and that is the lamentation, women's lamentation, and basically ancient women lamentations, Middle Age lamentations, and today practice and lamentations in the Balkans are pretty much the same. And there were scientists, especially women, who were writing about it and confirming it for many decades ago. So we have direct links with antiquity. We have something that we can start from analogies and go further into the historical semantics, into etymologies, which are not the real witnesses to the antiquity, but they can help, and also mentioning in the ancient texts. So yes, there is this tiny but convincing textual past that we were exploring, studying Slavic mythology.
Brilliant. You mentioned Herodotus, and sort of, I was quite not surprised, but I was really interested when you sort of brought a couple of comparisons to classical myths, so Greek myths, with the Jason and the Argonauts, and there was the part with, I think it's Vasilissa, and then her trials with the small doll made me think of the trials that Venus makes Psyche go through. There are very many links that I found with the Greek myths. Is there a lot of them that run through sort of undercurrents of Slavic myths, or is it sort of just a handful that you focused on in your book as well?
Well, no, if you allow me to answer this question, there is a clear line about ancient deities performing as saints in the Middle Ages, in the Byzantine culture, but also in the Western culture, the same, and then in the modern times. So you have the exciting case of a female saint who is called Petka, or Greek Paraskevi, or also Paraskeva in Serbo-Croatian, and so on and so on. This saint is a direct descent, if you want, of Demetra and her daughter, Kore. But this time is Friday, Saint Friday. This is the translation of Petka, and her daughter Nedelka, which is Sunday. And in between is the Saturday, Sabbath, which is the Day of the Dead. And the name of the saint is translated from Hebrew. It's a preparation for Saturday. So this saint was introduced in the medieval Balkans as a kind of political relief, if you want, for many women who remained widows after the Battle of Kosovo, and in very uncertain times. So the female rulers of Serbia, of this very, very little kingdom of Serbia, two women introduced these remains, were traveling to Bulgaria to get her remains, got them, and transferred them to Serbia, and it was a female saint of the first class. In the oral poetry, Saint Friday sits on the right side of the supreme saint, Saint Elias. This is a very folklore version. It's not a church version, of course. And on the other side, on the left side, there's, of course, the Sunday, Nedelka, her daughter. It's a pair in which father is not known at all. So Saint has a daughter from whom? Who's the father? Nobody knows, doesn't matter, because there's a link between mother and daughter, just like in Demeter's myth. And then Saint Petka or Saint Friday helps women in their everyday chores, in medicine, helps them when they're giving birth or being sick, and also fights for women's rights in a way, because there are many rules about punishing aggressive men. And one of them is, if you want your husband to get really sick, you wash his clothes on Thursday evening. So remember this.
That's very specific, and I like that a lot. Very cool. I was wondering, I found it really interesting that you opened your book with vampires, which is obviously a very common supernatural figure in modern pop culture. But I was even more interested with its sort of intrinsic connection with werewolves. Would you mind just telling us a little bit about the history of these two supernatural figures and how they started so close together and maybe and now so
Sure. Perhaps the
far
biggest
apart?
surprise for readers who will have heard, if they've heard of anyone from the mythological figures in this book, will have heard of vampires and werewolves. But the surprise is that in ancient Slavic tradition, they're one and the same creature. There's a term vukodlak, which would mean like wolf skin or wolf fur. And that was the term for these creatures, but it was such a scary term that you weren't supposed to say it out loud. It was like Voldemort from Harry Potter. And instead you could say vampir. And we have this hybridization. Werewolves in the Slavic tradition don't transform into like a humanoid wolf hybrid, the way we think of in like recent films, but they actually transform into wolves themselves. And there's a tradition of this dating back to their ancient Greek sources describing certain peoples who could transform into wolves. Vuk, which means wolf in Serbian, is the most important totemic animal to the ancient Slavs. And it was considered something to worship. It was a deity, but it was also something to fear. It's the creature most likely to eat you if you're living in Europe in the ancient times. And you could give your child the name Vuk, which would have protective qualities. And the idea is what you name your child will help predict its future and his personality traits. So we have this important aspect of it. And then the vampire side was this combination of these people who are either they can be cursed in life and become werewolves, or you have this animagus concept that you can transform yourself willfully into an animal by casting a spell. And you have these vampires who are rising from their graves, attacking their loved ones usually, which is a distinction from the later popularization of the myth after Bram Stoker's Dracula, and can transform into wolves. But they can also transform into other things. And this idea, it's like a super creature that was deconstructed into several different mythological creatures later on. One of the things that's most interesting, I think, is the early letters sent by Austro-Hungarian officers who were observing strange and creepy behaviors in Serbian villages that were on the fringes of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the language of them is interesting because you have these very enlightened, Christian, thoughtful men being very Austrian and explaining what's happening, and it doesn't make any sense to them, and you can feel like their head's going to explode, but they're trying to report back what's happening. And people in these villages were disinterring recently deceased villagers and killing them again in weird ways, and complaining that these recently deceased villagers were attacking people in the village, including their family members. And it was super creepy, very I'm going to say unrational, very irrational, and the opposite of what a good Catholic is supposed to do. Once you're dead and buried in a cemetery, that's it. And it really, these reports, they were nonfiction, that they were reports, the Austrians, we can't say that they believed that vampires were a real supernatural creature. They were just reporting what they observed and heard from villagers. That really inflected the popular imagination, and there was a European-wide craze of interest in vampires in various languages, English, French especially. And that long preceded Dracula, which was let's say, the zenith of the craze, the thing that made it really ubiquitous worldwide. And a lot of those stories and the elements of what I would say the rules of vampires in the Dracula novel come from these ancient Slavic myths, as well as some of the popularizations of things like plays and other novels and short stories involving vampires that preceded it.
Wow. Yeah, that's incredible. So there's been so much development with these figures. I did want to ask, this is very sort of more obscure, probably maybe the last question, is the hawthorn tree. It's used as a stake to kill vampires, werewolves, but also the main figure in your, I think it's the werewolf story, creates a butterfly out of it, but then the hawthorn also turns up later in your story with Vasilisa. Is there a specific importance with this, with hawthorn, that makes it sort of pop up so much?
Svetlana, go ahead if you like.
Well, there's a part that I'm regretting so much in this book. There was no space to expand on plants. And this is maybe the most important part of the Slavic mythology in everyday life, because it's practiced even today. And it's so immensely rich, and it's so immensely practical that I really regret the very, very condensed part we consecrated to plants. Yes, plants are the extremely important instrument of every magic that you can imagine in Slavic mythology, every shamanic action and behavior that you can imagine, and shamanism is at the core of the Slavic myths. It's the main technique of doing things and changing world in Slavic myths. So yes, hawthorn is extremely important, but hawthorn is also the symbol of health. And when you want to say that someone is healthy, you say he's like a hawthorn. He's completely healthy. So there are beliefs that are preserved in language, in idioms, in everyday communication, and also in everyday practices. And this huge and vast area of meanings and actions and practicalities is simply omitted because we didn't have space. Otherwise, that there's a very little list of things you can do with plants, which I insisted to put it into the book. But otherwise, yes, do explore this area, because it's immense, and many myths are coming in a circular way. You use the plant, you see the functions, you imagine the story, and then the story itself produces new practices, new stories, new uses from the story. So it doesn't end ever in this use and this imaginary modes of doing things with plants.
Brilliant. Well, maybe the next book can just be dedicated to the use of plants. I'm sure many of our viewers would be very interested in reading that as well. That is probably a good place to leave off. Thank you so much to both of you for joining me on the channel. And your book, The Slavic Myths, is available to purchase from Thames and Hudson, and I will put the link down below for that. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you very much.
This video is brought to you by World History Encyclopedia. For more great articles and interactive content, head to our website via the link below. If you like my sweater, you can find this design and a bunch more in our shop at worldhistory.store, or you can find a link for it down below. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you soon with another video.